What if the most dangerous thing in a society isn't poverty, but the quiet admiration of something completely empty? Because inside the world of the Great Gatsby, nothing begins with truth. It begins with perception. A shimmering surface of wealth, parties, an endless motion that feels meaningful from a distance, but collapses the closer you get. And here's the first contradiction: the more complete the illusion looks, the less there actually is beneath it. So the question isn't what this world is. The real question is, why does it feel so desirable even when it's fundamentally hollow? Look closer at its structure. East Egg, West Egg, New York. 3 spaces, but not geographical distinctions, psychological ones. Status, aspiration, and appetite. In this system, value is not created through substance, but through visibility. You are not rewarded for who you are. You are rewarded for how convincingly you can be seen. And this creates a subtle but powerful cognitive distortion. Wealth stops being a tool and becomes a disguise. A disguise for responsibility, for consequence, even for identity itself. Here's the first memory fragment worth holding onto: the green light. Not as a symbol of hope, but as a projection machine. A distant glow that doesn't guide action, it replaces reality with anticipation. The further it is, the more powerful it becomes. That is the system's first trick: meaning is strongest when it is unreachable. But then comes the deeper contradiction. In this world, excess does not lead to fulfillment. It leads to invisibility of emptiness. The louder the parties, the less anyone is actually present. The more people gathered, the fewer connections formed. It is not chaos, it is organized detachment. So what is the real consequence of this structure? It produces a strange form of envy. Not envy of wealth itself, but envy of the ability to remain untouched by consequences. A kind of moral insulation where actions float free of accountability. And this is where the system becomes dangerous, not because it is corrupt, but because it is seductive. Because once people start admiring that insulation, they stop asking whether the world itself is functional. They only ask how to enter it. And that leads to a scale shift that cannot be ignored. This is no longer just about individuals inside a story. It becomes a model for modern aspiration itself, where image replaces substance, and prestige becomes a shield against truth. A system where dysfunction doesn't break status, it defines it. But there is still a question that refuses to settle. Why do people, even when they sense the emptiness, still reach toward it? Why does a hollow world feel like progress rather than decay? And what does it say about desire itself if it can be fully captured by something that contains nothing real inside it? Because if emptiness can be admired, then perhaps the most important part of this system isn't what it hides. It's what it reveals about the people watching it. The deeper you look into this world, the more unsettling the question becomes, not what people gain from it, but what they willingly ignore in order to desire it. Because in the world of the Great Gatsby, perception is not just influence. It is currency. And once perception becomes currency, truth quietly loses its market value. So what exactly is being traded here? At first glance, it looks like wealth exchanging hands, luxury circulating through parties, identities shifting across rooms filled with light and music. But underneath that surface, something more abstract is happening. People are not trading money. They are trading distance, from consequence, from responsibility, from emotional accountability. And here is where the first contradiction emerges: the more someone appears socially connected, the more isolated they actually become. Connection becomes performance. Presence becomes decoration. One memory fragment lingers here: the endless parties. Rooms full of motion, laughter, glass clinking, but no lasting imprint. People arrive, consume the atmosphere, and disappear without residue. It is not community. It is temporary visibility. And that distinction changes everything. Now the question shifts. If connection is simulated, what is actually holding this system together? The answer is unsettling: belief. Not belief in each other, but belief in the illusion that participation equals meaning. That simply being inside the system is enough to justify its emptiness. And this belief is powerful because it is invisible. It does not announce itself as ideology. It feels like aspiration. But here comes a sharper revelation: the system does not require everyone to be wealthy. It only requires everyone to believe that wealth equals immunity. Immunity from judgment. Immunity from consequence. Immunity from collapse. And that belief creates a structural distortion. When people like Tom Buchanan operate inside this world, their actions are not evaluated in moral terms. They are evaluated in social terms. What matters is not what is done, but what can be sustained without breaking image. That is the true architecture of power here. Meanwhile, figures like Great Gatsby reveal another layer of contradiction. He is not simply chasing success. He is chasing validation from a system that already decided he does not belong. And yet, the more he achieves visibility, the further he moves from resolution. Recognition becomes a loop that never closes. This is the second memory fragment: the green light does not get closer. It only becomes brighter the longer it remains unreachable. That is not hope, it is engineered distance. And here is the consequence that begins to emerge across the system: when status becomes protection, truth becomes optional. People no longer ask what is real. They ask what is accepted. Now the scale shifts again. This is no longer about individuals or even a social class. It becomes a pattern of civilization, where appearance replaces accountability, and where systems survive not by solving contradictions, but by aestheticizing them. So the question deepens, and becomes harder to ignore. If a society can function while disconnecting truth from consequence, then what exactly is it optimizing for? And more importantly, if everyone can see the emptiness but still moves toward it, what does that reveal about the real architecture of desire itself? At a certain point in this system, the question is no longer what people believe, but why they continue believing it even after seeing the fracture lines beneath it. Because once you recognize the structure from inside the world of the Great Gatsby, something unsettling becomes unavoidable. The illusion is not maintained by ignorance. It is maintained by participation. People know, at some level, that the surface is constructed. Yet they continue to treat it as real because stepping outside it requires confronting something far more uncomfortable than deception: emptiness without narrative. So the crisis begins here. Not in the system itself, but in the moment awareness collides with desire. And this is where the contradiction sharpens. In a world where everything is visible, nothing is truly acknowledged. Status is publicly measured, yet privately meaningless. Social presence expands, yet emotional reality contracts. The system does not hide its hollowness. It displays it, carefully curated, as if emptiness itself is a form of sophistication. One memory fragment emerges again: the endless movement of guests through grand spaces. Rooms filled with sound, light, and motion, but no lasting imprint of connection. Not because connection is impossible, but because permanence is never the goal. The goal is continuation of appearance. Now the escalation becomes unavoidable. Because figures like Daisy Buchanan are not simply individuals inside this structure. They are reflections of its core logic. Presence without responsibility. Attraction without consequence. Influence without accountability. And this is where the contradiction stops being personal and becomes systemic. At the same time, Great Gatsby represents the opposite force inside the same machine. He believes intensity of desire can overwrite structural limitation. That belief is powerful, but it is also misaligned with how the system actually operates. Because the system does not reward intensity. It rewards invisibility of contradiction. Here is the first revelation inside this stage: the more someone tries to resolve illusion through effort, the more deeply they become embedded inside it. Effort does not break the structure. It reinforces the narrative that the structure is worth entering. And this leads to consequence. The world does not collapse under the weight of its emptiness. It stabilizes through repetition. The same patterns of gathering, admiration, and departure continue without interruption. Meaning is not required for continuity. Only momentum is. Now the scale shifts again. What begins as a social environment becomes a behavioral blueprint. A model where individuals learn that visibility is more valuable than authenticity, and that being seen matters more than being understood. Over time, this does not just shape behavior. It shapes perception itself. Another memory fragment surfaces, the green light. Still distant. Still glowing. Not as a destination, but as a calibration point for desire. The further it remains, the more it defines direction. And yet, it never resolves into arrival. So the system reveals a deeper paradox. If everything is already known to be constructed, why does construction still hold authority over perception? Why does awareness not dissolve participation? And as this question deepens, a more uncomfortable layer emerges beneath it. What if the real power of this world is not that it hides emptiness, but that it makes emptiness feel like something worth reaching for? But then the question fractures further. If desire can be fully shaped by something that contains nothing to offer in return, then what exactly is driving desire itself? So at the deepest level of this structure, the question stops being about why people are drawn to illusion, and becomes about what illusion is actually doing to the architecture of desire itself. And here is the first true revelation. Within the world of the Great Gatsby, illusion is not a distortion of reality. It is a replacement for reality that functions more efficiently than truth ever could. Because truth demands resolution. Illusion only demands continuation. That is the hidden mechanism. Not deception, but sustainability through incompleteness. And once this becomes visible, everything reorders itself. Desire is no longer a personal force. It becomes a designed loop. A system where longing is structured to remain unfulfilled just enough to stay active, but never resolved enough to end. That is why the green light persists as a memory fragment. It is not a destination. It is a regulated distance. A calibrated absence that produces motion without arrival. Now the deeper insight emerges. Characters like Gatsby are not simply chasing love or status. They are participating in a feedback loop where meaning is generated by pursuit itself. The system does not reward completion. It rewards infinite approach. The closer you believe you are, the more power the system has over your perception of value. And this reframes everything. Because what appears to be social aspiration is actually structural dependency on incompletion. The world only functions as long as no one fully arrives at what they are seeking. That is the revelation that destabilizes the entire architecture. Even figures like Daisy Buchanan are not anomalies within the system. They are stabilizers. Their role is not to fulfill desire, but to ensure desire remains interpretable. They give shape to longing without resolving it, maintaining the illusion that fulfillment is just slightly out of reach, rather than structurally impossible. Here is the consequence. A society built on this logic does not collapse under failure. It evolves through perpetual deferral. Success becomes indistinguishable from postponement. Achievement becomes indistinguishable from pursuit. And eventually, people stop distinguishing between having something and chasing it. Now the scale shift becomes unavoidable. This is no longer about a single social class or a historical moment. It becomes a model for how meaning systems operate when they decouple reward from resolution. A civilization does not need truth to function. It only needs enough structured absence to keep desire active. Another memory fragment returns, but now with sharper clarity. The green light is not merely distant. It is structurally untouchable. Its function is not to be reached, but to define the emotional geometry of reaching itself. And this leads to the final unfolding tension. If illusion is not a flaw in perception, but a functional system for sustaining desire, then what exactly happens to human identity when desire is no longer aimed at truth, but engineered around distance? And more dangerously, if a system can survive indefinitely by preventing completion, then what does it mean to ever believe something was meant to be fulfilled at all? Then the question becomes unavoidable. If desire is not broken, but deliberately structured to never complete itself, what does that reveal about the system that produces it, and about the people who continue to sustain it? Here is the core revelation. Inside the world of the Great Gatsby, the central illusion is not wealth, and not even status. It is the belief that fulfillment is located somewhere ahead in time, when in reality the system is designed so that fulfillment is always displaced, never arrived at. The entire architecture is built on a silent agreement. Meaning must always remain slightly out of reach, because if it were ever fully attained, the system would collapse under its own clarity. This is why the green light persists as a memory fragment. It is not a symbol of hope in the traditional sense. It is a mechanism of controlled distance. A fixed point that stabilizes motion by ensuring no one ever stops moving. It does not promise arrival. It promises continuity. And once this is understood, the roles inside the system reorganize themselves. Great Gatsby is not simply a dreamer misaligned with reality. He is the purest expression of a system that converts longing into identity. His entire existence is structured around approaching something that gains its power precisely because it resists completion. His tragedy is not ignorance. It is participation in a rule that cannot be broken from within. At the same time, Daisy Buchanan represents something more precise than emotional detachment. She is the embodiment of how the system converts human presence into symbolic value. Not as a person to be understood, but as a reference point for desire that must remain unresolved in order to function. So the insight expands. What looks like a social world is actually a desire engine. A structure that converts emotional pursuit into continuous motion, while ensuring that resolution is always displaced. It does not fail to deliver meaning. It succeeds by never delivering it fully. And this leads to a deeper consequence. In such a system, identity itself becomes unstable. People no longer define themselves by what they have achieved, but by what they are still approaching. The self becomes a trajectory rather than a state. A direction without arrival. And over time, this creates a strange psychological dependency. Stopping feels like disappearance. Now the scale shifts further outward. This is no longer just about individuals inside a narrative environment. It becomes a model for modern perception itself. A civilization quietly structured around perpetual incompletion, where progress is measured not by resolution, but by sustained anticipation. Even success becomes another form of delay. One memory fragment remains constant beneath everything, the green light, always visible, always distant, never consumed. Not because it cannot be reached, but because its function depends on never being reached. It is not a goal. It is a calibration of desire. And here lies the deepest philosophical weight of the system. If a world can generate meaning not through fulfillment, but through the infinite postponement of fulfillment, then what we call aspiration may not be a movement toward truth at all. It may be a carefully maintained distance from it. And if that distance is the true engine of desire, then the most unsettling question is no longer why people pursue it, but whether anything meaningful would remain if they ever actually arrived. From this point onward, everything that looked like desire begins to reveal its final cost, not as an event, but as a lingering structure that continues long after the moment has passed. Because in the world of the Great Gatsby, what remains after the illusion is not clarity. It is residue. Psychological, social, and emotional residue that reorganizes how people interpret value itself. And the consequence is not immediate collapse. It is adaptation. The system does not break when its illusion is exposed. It evolves. It learns how to survive awareness. People continue to move through it, but now with an additional layer of tension. They recognize the structure, yet still operate inside it as if recognition changes nothing. That is the first legacy. A world where understanding no longer leads to exit. Now the impact becomes visible through its central figures. Great Gatsby leaves behind more than a failed pursuit. He leaves behind a psychological template, the idea that identity can be constructed entirely through anticipation. That who you are is defined not by arrival, but by what you are still trying to reach. His legacy is not success or failure. It is the normalization of permanent incompletion as a form of selfhood. And this is where the second consequence emerges. When incompletion becomes identity, fulfillment begins to feel like disappearance. People stop fearing failure and start fearing stillness. Because stillness removes the narrative that keeps the self coherent. At the same time, Daisy Buchanan leaves a different kind of residue. Not emotional impact, but structural permission. The permission for presence without accountability. For influence without consequence. For beauty, status, or attraction to exist independently from ethical weight. This is the deeper legacy of the system. It separates visibility from responsibility until they no longer feel connected. Now the scale shift becomes unavoidable. What begins as a social configuration transforms into a cultural operating system. One where individuals are trained to interpret distance as value, and absence as significance. Even memory begins to distort. The green light is no longer just a fragment of desire, it becomes a pattern of interpretation. Always visible. Always deferred. Always just outside completion. And this is the third memory fragment that now changes meaning, the endless movement of guests through illuminated spaces. What once seemed like celebration now reads differently. Not connection, but circulation. Not belonging, but temporary absorption into a system that requires constant motion to maintain the illusion of meaning. The legacy of this structure is not simply that people chase unattainable things. It is that they begin to distrust anything that can actually be held. And this is where the philosophical weight intensifies. Because once a civilization internalizes the idea that value increases with distance, it begins to reorganize itself around absence. Not what is present, but what is implied. Not what is complete, but what is withheld. And over time, even truth becomes less important than its potential to remain unresolved. So the consequence is no longer confined to the story world. It extends outward. If meaning is sustained not by arrival, but by permanent deferral, then what happens to a mind that finally stops moving toward something? Does it discover truth, or does it lose the only structure that made identity feel real in the first place? And if that structure is all that remains, then the final question is not what was lost inside the illusion, but whether anything survives outside of it at all. In the end, what remains is not the world that was shown, but the way that world reshaped the mind that observed it. Because within the structure of the Great Gatsby, nothing truly resolves in the way people expect resolution. Instead, everything transforms into residue, patterns of longing, patterns of interpretation, patterns of belief that continue long after the final moment disappears. And this is the final realization: the story was never about what was achieved. It was about what could never stop being reached. That is the final layer of its legacy. Not success, not failure, but continuation disguised as meaning. And once this becomes visible, the figures inside it stop functioning as characters and start functioning as systems of reflection. J. Gatsby is not remembered because he reached something real. He is remembered because he revealed a structure where the act of reaching matters more than arrival itself. His legacy is not ambition. It is the psychological transformation of desire into identity, where a person becomes indistinguishable from what they are still chasing. At the same time, Daisy Buchanan does not survive in memory as a person who chose or rejected anything in a simple sense. She survives as a signal of how meaning can be suspended inside presence itself, where what is felt is always slightly disconnected from what is understood, and that gap becomes the space where illusion lives. And then the final memory fragments return, not as images, but as echoes of structure, the green light. Always distant, never consumed. The endless rooms of motion and brightness that never settle into permanence. The feeling that visibility itself is more powerful than truth, because visibility can exist without resolution. But the final insight is not about illusion continuing. It is about what illusion reveals when it can no longer be mistaken for reality. It reveals that human desire is not built around possession. It is built around direction. Around movement toward something that must remain partially out of reach in order to feel meaningful. And when that distance disappears, something far more unstable appears in its place, uncertainty about the self. So the legacy of this world is not that people were deceived. It is that they learned how to live inside structures where meaning depends on incompletion, and identity depends on pursuit. And this is why the story still matters. Because it is not describing a distant social world. It is exposing a recurring pattern in human perception itself, the tendency to treat distance as value, and pursuit as proof of significance. And if that pattern is still active beyond the boundaries of the story, then the final question is no longer about the world that was left behind. It is about whether we are still living inside the same invisible architecture, still mistaking the feeling of approaching meaning for meaning itself, and whether we would even recognize life if nothing was left for us to chase.